Welcome to another segment of Provocative Conversations, destined to provoke further thought and spark greater questions regarding God, church, and the religious establishments of both the past and the present. I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. Your perception of God means everything. Your perception of God means everything. I just want to touch on a few verses just for the record. Mark chapter 15, verse 32. Mark 15 and 32. Each of these will be in the King James Version. It says, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Again, perception is about seeing. To perceive is to see a thing. Notice that he said that we may see and believe. In other words, with God, you're going to have to see some things in order to believe some things. Now, let me get this straight. You don't necessarily, and oftentimes God doesn't want you to have to see a thing in order to believe a thing. He wants you to believe without seeing. The Bible says, "Blessed are those who hadn't seen and yet they believe." So the fact that you haven't seen and you still believe is where God wants you to be. And it shows the degree of faith that you're actually walking in. Peter probably couldn't have seen himself walking on the water, but he saw it enough, or he believed it enough to the point that he actually saw. You can see a thing to a certain degree and you believe it, and then you experience some things, and then you see it even further, and then you believe it even more, and it builds upon itself. But seeing and believing, what I'm talking about is actually seeing a thing from your perspective, from your view of God, from your insight into God, your revelation of God. How much do you see? Because how much you see will determine how much you believe. John chapter 4, verse 48 says this, "Then Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe." Again, I said, see how seeing and believing go together, and without one, you won't have the other. Now, he was rebuking them to a certain degree by saying, you won't even believe me until you see signs and wonders. You won't even believe me until you see through your five senses. And like I said, as you grow in God and as you go into deeper depths and heights with God, God is going to stop showing you certain things in the midst of stuff. You won't see things. You will just hear him from within you. You won't see any indication of it. You won't hear anything. Why? Because God is trying to wean you from your five senses so that you can believe him from what you see within your spirit, within your core being, within that part of you that has its godness, that possesses, or where you possess your God likeness. Like godness. I know that sounds almost blasphemous, to make yourself equal to God. But Jesus said, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. Unless we perceive God in the fullness or in the person of his true nature, in his true essence, we will not believe. We will not trust. We will not believe regarding God for anybody unless we can see God embracing certain people, we will not embrace those people. Unless we can see God delivering such a person, we will not believe enough to do the same in the name of God or that God has done. John chapter 6 verse 30 says, therefore they said to him, what sign will you perform then that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? You'll get to a point where God won't do any work. Look, I told you, and that's the bottom line. Abraham, I need you to get up, and I need you to leave the country that you're in. You're going to a place where I'm going to build a nation out of you. Abraham, you're going to have, your wife is going to have a child. Now, I know you all are good and old. I know that nothing has happened like this before. And I know that there's no precedent for this. There's no one else to look at and say, well, God did it for them, so, perhaps it will happen for me, or truly it will happen for me. There was no one to compare stories with or glean from. God was giving him information that he just had to believe God, because there was no one else to refer to as a point of reference or as someone who could mentor him on how to handle this thing regarding God. No, I'm telling you, Abram, this is what you're going to do. Rather, this is what I'm going to do. You're just going to have to believe me. So all this hoping that God will perform a sign or a wonder or anything, God may not show you anything. He'll tell you and he'll leave it at that. And then you won't hear any more about it for months or maybe years. And you're just going to have to believe it from this point to the point that it actually comes about. Seeing and believing. How you see God determines how you believe God. How much you see God doing determines how much you believe him to keep doing, or how much you believe he actually did. John chapter 20 verse 25 says it like this. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see his, this is when Jesus had died and risen again, and he was walking the earth again, and the other disciples ran to him and said, look, we've seen the Lord. And he said, unless I see his hands, the print of the nails, and put my fingers into the print where the nails were, and put my hand into his side where they pierced his side, I will not believe. Notice how seeing and believing work together. You can't believe beyond what you see. You can't believe beyond how you're able to perceive. Your perception means everything, especially in regard to your belief. John chapter 20, verse 29 says it like this. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you've now believed. But blessed are those who have not seen. They didn't get to see me in my risen state, physical risen state. They did not get to see these holes in my hand and in my feet. They did not get to see my side pierced, but you have. And he said, but blessed are those who hadn't seen this and yet have believed. It's awesome to not have been able to see the risen state of Jesus and yet believe in what you do know of him enough that you would believe that he had risen. Whether this is a literal sense or an allegorical, metaphorical, I'm not sure. But anyway, However it is, still, oftentimes God will show you enough. You've not been in this situation, but God has shown you enough in those situations that that's enough for you to believe in to get through this situation. But if you didn't perceive him or couldn't receive him or perceive him in those situations, you're definitely not going to be able to perceive him without actually seeing him in this situation. Those situations gives you ability. They enable you to believe him when you no longer can pick him up through your five sensors. When when you're not getting that phone call for that job, when you're not hearing from that child, when you're not receiving from that person and you're not getting any letters and you don't know what's going on and you don't know the status, but you do know that God told you that don't worry about it, it's all right. And that's all you got. It's all right. God, do you know how important this is? Do you know how much is riding on this? And you're just saying it's all right. It'll be all right. What is that telling me, God? That's not telling me anything. It doesn't have to tell you anything because it's telling you everything. Why? It's based upon how much you perceive that I love you, how much you perceive that I'm for your benefit, how much you're able to trust me that I got your best interests in mind. So, it's very possible for a person to step out in faith in a particular area without ever having experienced God on a personal level in that particular manner or in that particular area. I'm sure Peter, before he walked on water, never walked on water before. But he had enough regarding Jesus or God, however you want to put it, that enabled him to go out there and walk as far as he did. But it is possible to step out in faith in a particular area, even though you've never experienced God on that level, in that particular manner, in that particular area. Because it doesn't matter necessarily what God has brought you through. Abraham had never left his family before like that. Sarah had never given birth to a child before Isaac. All of this was new to her. All of this was new to them. Moses had never seen God deliver millions of people out of Egyptian captivity. Aaron hadn't seen it, but they had to go do it. They had never seen anyone walk through the Red Sea and the waters part and open out for them to walk on dry ground, but they had to do it. And they were willing to do it because they walked on something God had told them. In Hebrews 11, chapter 8, it says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. When God told him to leave your people, I'm bringing you to another country, another place, and you will receive this as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. He had never been there before. See how he stepped out in faith without ever having experienced having to do that before? It's possible to do it. Apparently, he had a word and he had some small, though it may have been, I'm not sure, perception of God. He had enough of God to step out there and do that. And as he stepped out there and did that, God built upon that and showed him more of himself. And then he believed more. And then he stepped out and did that. And as he believed more, and he went further and further and further and further. It built upon itself. In verse 11 of Hebrews 11, all of these are New King James Version, it says, by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised him. She had never seen, and I'm showing you there are certain, I don't know if these are exceptions to how much you can perceive of God and yet still walk out in faith. But I know this, your perception of God does affect everything that you do and everything that occurs in your life. It plays a role, and as far as how you receive it or how you reject it, how you receive others, how you reject others, how you treat them. But also, I know by these verses that it is possible for you to do certain things that you've never done before with very little revelation of God beyond a certain revelation or whatever. I don't know if it was different back then than it is now, and they were able to do it easier. I'm not sure. It would seem like it would have been harder then than now, but, it is what it is. She judged him faithful who had promised. Remember, she was past the childbearing age. She was past being able to conceive a child. She couldn't even do it in a young age. And yet, I guess she couldn't have a children in her young age. I know this. She got old and didn't have any. Yet she judged God faithful enough, able enough to do what he had promised. Remember, I said, as your faith goes forth, you're able to experience more of God. Her faith went forth and she was able to experience a supernatural enablement to do what apparently she was never able to do. I'm not sure she was never able to do it, or they didn't care to have children, and then at the end of her life, she, I don't know. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8. It says, with whom having not seen, you love. You've never seen God. Remember, Jesus told Thomas, he said, Thomas, you got to see the scars on my hand and the holes, and you got to see these things. He said, but blessed is the one who won't get to see these holes in my hand and yet believe in me. And here it is. It says, whom having not seen, you love. We've never seen God, not in that sense, not in a physical sense, but we have seen God through revelational knowledge. And maybe that's what Sarah was working with. Well, undoubtedly, that's what Abraham was working with. Some degree of revelational knowledge to the point that he was able to actually picture what God was saying to him. I don't know what God showed him or her or her, but it says, whom having not seen you love. You still love him, even though you hadn't seen him. We've never seen God, yet we love him. But we have seen him through our inner man. Though now you do not see him, yet believing. In other words, you don't see him, but yet you're believing. No, I hadn't seen you do this before, God, but I believe that you can do it and that you will do it. No, I hadn't read of you saying a lot of the things that I hear people like Carlton or even myself saying, but I believe, God, that you can do that and that you are doing that. You don't have to wait on the bandwagon to begin to believe. That's not believing. That's just following the crowd. Once you got to wait to that point. Can you believe when there is no indicator outside of the one that you're receiving? Can you believe when there is no visual there outside of what you know in your spirit that is true? John chapter 20, verse 29 is where Jesus said to Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. But he says, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. That's where 1 Peter 1 and 8 comes in. So there really is no such thing as blind faith, because faith is not blind. No, faith sees something beyond the natural sensors, beyond what the natural sensors can pick up. Faith sees something in the spirit realm, in the realm that we do not see, in that unrevealed area, that revelational realm, that realm that is hidden from the naked eye. Because faith is not blind. but rather faith sees more clearly than one's natural eyes. And we think that faith is blind. That's blind faith, when you just believe God for something you've never experienced and you believe. No, it's not that I just believe God in that sense. And people say, I just believe God. No, you don't. No, you don't. You wake up screaming out of dreams and everything else. What you scared for? You believe God. You know He's going to take care of you. Or do you? You see? So we don't believe that, like we say. We just talking, okay? Hebrews 11 verses 9 and 10 kind of echoes this. It says, by faith, Abraham dwelt in the land of promise. You know, that land that God promised him? He settled there by faith. He had no rights to that land. His ancestors didn't have that land necessarily. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country. He lived there like, I am a foreigner. I don't belong here. Not I don't belong here because God told me to come here. But I'm leaving my country where my people were and where we had certain rights there. And I'm going to a country that God promised me and told me to go to. And I got to live here like I'm an undocumented alien. And that's something, I'm going to keep going first. Dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him on the same promise, you know, Isaac and Jacob, because his son Isaac ended up having Jacob. Jacob. So it's just really talking about the ancestors, but it's the same promise that they were all up under that same promise, and they all dwelt there waiting on that promise to come forth, which that promise didn't come forth necessarily until after the children of Israel were released from Egypt, and then they went about and started settling in the Canaanite land and the land of the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, and all of them other ites. So he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He waited for the city. I'm not even going to go there because that's going to open up another area. By faith, he ended up dwelling in a place that God had promised him. So apparently he saw something beyond his natural eyes, beyond his natural senses, because his natural eyes let him know, you're in a foreign country. You don't own nothing here. Yet spiritually, he had a revelation from God that this is where you got to be. And you and your son Isaac and his son Jacob, y'all got to be here. Why? Because I'm giving all of your descendants all that you can see. So in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises. So they died believing what God told them before they ever received it. So they lived in that faith, at least in that area of their life. They lived in that faith for a long period of time, which is why I believe that God must have given them a strong revelational inception or revelational insight into what he was going to do for them, because they all had to live it out to the point of their death, having not received the promises, but having seen those promises afar off. You see how their faith remained as long as they saw those promises afar off. They saw them. So God showed them enough. They perceived enough. God impressed upon their perspective of him enough that their faith was able to not just kick in, but stay kicked in all the way up to the point of their death. Having seen what God told them afar off, were assured of those things. They embraced those things and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They embraced everything that God told them supernaturally, apparently, and yet they confess that we understand that we are just pilgrims wandering, waiting on our assigned home. And that's where verse 10, it says he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And I don't want to get into all of that. But anyway, what I want to say there about that foreign country it's sad that of where we are, how we look at foreigners, and how the current political administration that's in power are doing away with all of these so-called foreigners, all of these people who were not born here, aliens, like they came from outer space or somewhere, like they aren't human beings. And then the church world is approving of this and they're accepting of it. I think it's sick. I think it's foolish. I think it's stupid, but that's just my humanity speaking, because I know ultimately God is working and controlling a thing, and God knows what he's doing, and God is ultimately going to win out over all of this here. But in the meantime, and looking at it from a human perspective, I think it's sick, it's contradictory, and the Bible specifically tells you if you want to live by your Bible so to the point that it's infallible and you're not supposed to take anything away from it. The Bible specifically tells you on multiple verses, which I hope to soon be able to put it on recording, but I'll show the verses where God tells you how to treat the foreigner, how to treat those who are not from that particular area or whatever, or from that particular country, how we're to treat them and how we're to handle them. And that's not the way that they've been handled. Just like he told us how to treat slaves, and that wasn't how they treated the Christian authorities treated slaves, black slaves and all, especially when they founded that came over here and founded this United States, not discovered, but founded this United States of America. They didn't treat the Christian groups did not treat black slaves the way that the Bible tells them to. But yet they wanted to preach about, if you're a slave, then remain a slave. Seek not to be loose, and slaves obey your masters and all of this crazy stuff. But they didn't want to uphold that other stuff. So anyway, I'll talk about that some other time. The natural eyes of a person are restricted by their state of health and by obstacles and distance. In other words, your natural eyes, what you see through your five senses, it's restricted. It's restricted based upon what type vision do you have? Do you have 10, 15, 20, 20, 25, 40, 100, 400, what your vision is? It's restricted. Your physical eyes, your natural eyes are restricted as to what they can see. You remember how it said Abraham and those, they saw the promises afar off. Well, the natural eyes are restricted by health and by obstacles. If there's stuff in the way, you can't see over into Germany from where you are. First of all, your eye can't see that far. And secondly, that's a lot of water, a lot of ocean, a lot of buildings and everything in between you and there, and you cannot see through all of that. And distance itself, just the distance itself, is just too much for your eyes to overcome. So the natural eye is restricted to what it can see and how far off it can see. Whereas with that revealed knowledge or that revelational knowledge that is revealed to us, information that is revealed to us through the Spirit or through God speaking to us and enlightening us, spiritual eyes are perfect. The spiritual eyes can see beyond time, beyond space, beyond distance, beyond obstacles, beyond your physical health. The spiritual eyes can see stuff on your deathbed where you're at the point of death and you can still see some things. The Bible talks about when Stephen was being stoned and they stoned him to death for speaking truth. And it said in Stephen in the book of Acts, and it says Stephen looked up into heaven and he saw the heavens open or whatever, or something like that. And I want to say he saw Christ sitting at the right hand. Bottom line is the heavens opened up to him and he was able to see into a different realm. Some of these stories I might get a little off on, but the gist of the story I know, and the reason being is because I only deal now with principle. I don't deal with all the small, crazy stuff that people get caught up in and want to split hairs over, as though God was speaking in English, and that God didn't speak in Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew back then. He was speaking straight English, and interpretations are not lost. Words are not lost during interpretation, which is not true. So I don't get into a lot of that stuff now. I get to the principle of the story and the gist of what can be utilized and gleaned from, and then keep moving. I keep it moving. So knowledge that comes from God about a thing, and you see that internally, you see that within you, that's perfect knowledge, or that's perfect clarity in sight. You can see that regardless of your health or the obstacles or the distance of time and space. Hebrews 11:20 says this: by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau as he was getting ready to die, concerning things to come. In other words, on his deathbed, he was blessing his sons concerning futuristic things. Isaac had already lost his sight, or began losing his sight, because he couldn't even tell which one was Isaac and which one was Jacob and which one was Esau. He had to feel them. So his sight, physical sight, was already challenged, yet he could see afar off spiritually. He could see way over into the future. And he was talking to his son based upon his perception of God, his perception of the future, his perception of God's ability to do what he told him he was going to do in the future. So although one's faith is a matter of the heart, in some cases, it can prove to be very difficult, if not impossible, to be able to see beyond certain things. For a person to believe God without any prior experiences with God in certain magnitudes of events, depending on how hard that event is, depending on what you're going to have to go through, whether through personal or revelation or by the word of mouth, you're going to have to hear something. It's going to be hard for you to believe him without any prior experience with him in a certain magnitude that situation is requiring of you. You're going to have to hear it through word of mouth, through personal revelation, however God gets that information to you. For the most part, you need to you have to hear something from God. That's why when people say this one is going to hell, that one is going to hell, I'll ask them, did God say that to you? Did you hear that from God? I've yet to hear anybody tell me God said it. And even if they said God said it, I said, you're a lie. You are a lie, not you a lie, but you are a liar at this point. You are a liar in the answering of that question, because there is no way that God told you that outside of what you hear from your scriptures and from your pastor and your preachers and your whoever else you got going on. And that's the truth. Jesus never said it. Period. Judges 6. Verse 36 and 37, it says, Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor, and if there is dew on the floor only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. He said, look, God, if you claim that you're getting ready to bring us to battle and you're going to save us in the middle of this battle, what I need you to do, I'm going to put a piece of material on the floor, and I want dew in the morning to be on the material, but not on the ground. Now, if I see you do that, then I'll believe that you're going to do this. And you know what? God entertained that, and he did that to prove to him that I'm going to do it. I think then he went back and said, okay, now this time I want it on the ground and not on the fleece. But God did what what Gideon asked him to do, because that's what God was going to do. God was still growing them to the stage, to the point of being able to see him and to understand him. But they were still in that growth process, because these were the ones who came out with Joshua, not so much that came out with Moses. A lot of them died off, but perhaps some of the younger ones were still going through the book of Joshua, and then Judges came about. The Judges came about after Joshua. But it was a situation that he said, God, I can't believe you until you show me something. And that's why I said your belief will never go beyond your perception. Even though there are exceptions, the general rule is your belief will never go beyond your perception. In Romans chapter 10, verse 10, it says, for with the heart one believes. Why? Because within your heart is where you see a thing, within your spirit, within your inner self. That's where God reveals himself to you. And then you end up believing as he reveals. How you perceive in your heart is how you believe. Your belief is according to your heart's content. Verse 14 of Romans 10 says, and all of these are New King James Version, it says, how then shall they call on him whom they have not believed? In other words, you can't call on what you don't believe. And how can they believe on him whom they have not heard? You see, I got to hear. What are you hearing? Where's your perception coming from? Where's your belief founded upon? Is it upon you, or is it upon truth? You can't believe unless you have a thing, unless you hear a thing, unless you have some revelation or knowledge of a thing. And how should they hear without a preacher? Well, God is your preacher. The Holy Spirit is your preacher as he talks to you. Mark chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. But you first got to believe. But in order for you to believe, you have to see. You have to hear. Because it says, how can they believe without hearing? John chapter 11, verse 39 and 40. It says, Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to Jesus, Lord, by this time Lazarus is stinking, for he's been dead for 4 days, and you want me to take away the stone? Remember, they would bury them in caves on the side of a mountain and whatever. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see? See how a further experience of God was dependent upon how she believed, because your belief, first your experience brings your belief. How can they believe what they hadn't experienced or heard? And then once you hear a thing, how much you believe of that thing determines how much more you get to see of him revelationally. He said, now if you want to see God work, you got to believe further than what you've already believed. You believed up to the point that he died, that I could raise him. Now that he's been dead for 4 days, I'm just telling you to believe again so that you can also see even more, experience even more of the power of God. But he was going to do it regardless if she believed it or not. I don't see no indication that he wouldn't have. Verse 42, it says, and I know that you always hear me. Jesus talking to God. He said, I know that you always hear me, God. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. It said they couldn't even believe that he was actually sent by God. Jesus said, I had to talk to you, God, openly, outwardly, so that they could hear me talking to you and realize that I actually am from you, that I actually did come from you, that I and the Father are one. But they need to hear this. So I say this loud so that they might hear it, because how can they believe except they exactly hear? So, if you're ever going to step out into greater dimensions of faith, you must tap into greater dimensions of revelatory knowledge and experience with God's love. Not experiment, but experience with his love, which has to be more personal rather than mere words of mouth. Not just somebody telling you, a preacher just telling you. No. You need to get it personal. God has to come and reveal himself to you. Flesh and blood did not reveal this, you see. Romans 5 verses 3 through 5. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance produces experience or character. And experience, character. Hope. Now, hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts. See how it's poured out? See that? Poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who has given to us. Poured out. Experience. That word experience, tribulation, there you go, experience. Perseverance, to be able to experience. And as you experience more of God, it builds character. But that experience, that's what brings trust. That's what builds trust. As you experience him in the hard things and points and periods of your life where it crushes you. That's the experience. That's what tribulations are for. That's what persecutions are for. To build that experience in you. But you're going to have to believe him in and through those experiences. So, please by now understand that your perception of God is very important and that it means everything. It means everything to you, at least it should. And if it doesn't, it still does. It means everything to everyone that you will come into contact with, especially if you have a family. It means everything to hurting people. It means everything to the people that you may be condemning. They need a proper perspective from you regarding God. They need you to hold a proper perspective, a proper perception. How can they hear? How can they believe without hearing? And how can they hear if you don't know? It means everything. Do your best not to fail people or yourself. You'll never fail God, but don't fail others or yourself.